pass the torch of our next speaker, Ralf.
I think I'm not supposed to be the next,
No.
next speaker, if I may say so. That's been left to the experts, but I'm extremely happy to welcome Dr. Stanislava Mladenova, and it has been a desire of the two of us to do such an event, such a seminar for a long, long time, and I'm so happy that our longing for this event to happen is now unfolding. Stanislava is a global fellow at Brown University Center for Humanitarian Rights and Humanitarian Studies, and a fellow of the Irregular Warfare Initiative at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. Previously, Stanislava was a program officer at the U.S. Institute of Peace, Justice, and Security Dialogue Program, where she implemented projects that established dialogue and cooperation between the police forces, gendarmerie, and local communities in 6 West African countries. Prior to the U.S. Institute of Peace, Stanislava was a program manager for the Afghanistan Rising Initiative at the Atlantic Council in Washington, D.C., where she oversaw all daily activities in standing up the program. She also served as a political advisor to the NATO senior civilian representative in Kabul, Afghanistan, where she was responsible for advising the NATO ambassador on economic issues, governance, corruption, disaster management, gender, humanitarian assistance, and the recruitment of child soldiers. At NATO headquarters in Brussels, Stanislava was aligned NATO's organizational reform initiatives with alliance political and structural objectives. Her Directorate of Philosophy from the Department of War Studies at King's College London explored the functional relationship between the military and civilian entities in settings affected by low-intensity conflict and state fragility. Stanislava, it's a true pleasure to have you here with us today. Please, the stage is yours, and we are looking forward to what you got to tell.
Good morning from Washington, D.C., everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you for this kind introduction, and it's good to be back in among the NATO family. I want to thank Anthony for his remarks and use what he has set us up with to tee us off into a slightly different direction, and really as a layer to talk about the functional and technical piece of this context. I will touch a little bit on the political, but it really is mostly to frame it as something which is incredibly fluid and incredibly tricky, and literally the moment you think of some of the inputs you'd like to provide on this type of panel, the situation changes yet again. I would like to emphasize and again reiterate that I do not represent the United States or its policy, the United States government, the Department of Defense, or any of the federal agencies. I also do not represent Brown University or West Point in any of my views. These views are my own, derived from my own research as a scholar and a practitioner in these contexts. I will focus on the functional aspect of the civil-military engagement and discuss how this conflict has implications beyond the region and on the civil-military relationship globally. And I will do this by discussing 3 specific themes. First, the military is a development actor, and I will qualify that in just a moment. The role of military-to-military engagement in the civil-military relationship, and finally, trust building. And I will end by offering some reflections for us, some recommendations and things that we all as a community should be considering. So first of all, again, a lot of this comes from the US's role in this, and particularly as the US military is a development actor. I want to demystify a little bit and clarify what I mean by that, because we talk a lot about civ-mil humanitarian development, and generally civ-mil is associated with humanitarian response, such is the case here in the presentation of the laying out the context that we heard earlier from Kathleen and Rolf. And we often talk about the HDP nexus, humanitarian development peace nexus. And essentially, we're talking about how these sectors talk to one another. And Often we hear how the military doesn't really have a role outside of its core business, which of course is military matters. But I would like to counter that and talk about how the military very much is a development actor in its own right. And what I mean by that is its role in training other militaries and forces, building capacity, equipping, strengthening governance systems, and how to manage the security sector. Essentially, much like on the development side, a bilateral security donor would strengthen education institutions or processes, funding structures, providing direct money, training teachers. The same exact thing is done on the military to military side. And of course, in the United States, it's through security force assistance and foreign internal defense. The US military has a history of doing this, going back to the 1960s when it stood up what were then called Special Actions Forces units, which were really stood up globally in Asia, Latin America, the Middle East, and Africa. And these units will take a holistic approach, really including economic development, police control, and effective local government and non-security angles. So very much comprehensive in nature. And today, the US military continues to train and equip other militaries, including the IDF. And while a lot of this training may be focused on the kinetic in other contexts, it is actually, as I said, more holistic. And there are examples of where the US military has done this. In Colombia, for example, you might have heard of Acción Integral, which is the Colombian military civil affairs branch. They're highly professionalized. Their objective is for the Colombian military to establish legitimacy among the population. The same, Anthony touched upon Lebanon. In Lebanon, the same is occurring, the Lebanese armed forces and strengthening their ability to engage with the population. Again, a lot of this is on the ground, seeking to strengthen intelligence, access, and placement, and legitimize the force among the populace. But all of this is done through bilateral security agreements. And I would like to note that such agreements depend on what the host nation asks for. They're not done in a vacuum by any means. If the host nation does not ask for a CIMA capability, the US would not provide it. In this case, with the IDF, which is a more developed force, and of course, going back to multiple treaties and agreements the US has had with Israel, there's no CA branch, civil affairs branch as such being developed in this context, the way, for example, it's being worked on or has been worked on historically with Lebanon and Colombia. So why is this important? Why am I talking about the training piece? Because this brings me to my second point, which is that military to military engagement has a direct impact on the civilian environment and, by extension, the civil military relationship. Military training has a central role in everything that the military touches, specifically of the civilian environment, which is 95% of the civilian environment. So by extension, military to military training is also a direct factor in this relationship with population and organizations. And as mentioned, the US military can support a country through agreed security assistance, but it does not have control over how partner forces deploys that capability. And this is the very sensitive topic that we've all been observing, and certainly we've been hearing a lot about in Washington. One of the ways for ensuring accountability and transparency and ensuring that security assistance doesn't fall into the wrong hands, if you will, is through processes which most of you probably are familiar with, one of which is called LIHI vetting. And it's really a way to ensure that where assistance is being provided is not done in line with also human rights violations. This is something which, as bilateral security agreements are entered into, there's a whole vetting process that occurs. With that said, I must also reiterate that oftentimes the reduction or the increase of security force assistance is more a political decision rather than a technical or social consideration. The third point, which ties again directly into this, is on trust building. A lot of what we know, a lot of what my own research has focused on, and I've observed through my time in deployment in the field, is that personalities and not context or organization are the backbone of the civil-military relationship. There is evidence that preconceived notions of previous relationships between military and civilian actors can drive how well these entities can work well together from one context to the next. Trust is the most important precondition, as Anthony mentioned, in bringing the parties to the table, but also just everyday information exchange, which is usually based on non-negotiated agreements and occurs behind the scenes. What is happening in Gaza has an impact on how the ability to build trust can be undermined by a single event or context. And as Anthony mentioned, these are very fragile, fluid situations where a lot of work can go into building something up, and it just takes one event and one occurrence to set us back. And because of a single event happening in one context, it can, of course, spill into other contexts. And there's no doubt in anybody's mind that there's no doubt in anyone's mind whether what is happening right now in Gaza, as a case study, as you described it, will have an impact or cause permanent damage on how we think about building trust between civil and military actors and in civil military relations. In other words, what I just told you about personality-based very much can be overridden also by this event. In short, it's a multi-dimensional question. How can we build trust based on personalities, people at the table, and based on occurrences? And of course, none of this changes the needs on the ground. Whether we have trust or not, civ-mil interaction continues, business continues. Everyone needs access, both military and civilians. Everyone needs information, and everyone needs an understanding of each other's roles and responsibilities, whether it's from a humanitarian perspective, civilian government, or security. So what are some of the things that we should be considering and thinking about, and we as a community should really have in the back of our minds? First of all, going back to the military to military engagement and the military as a development actor of other militaries, there is no guarantee in how a partner force will use what you trained it to do. Yes, there are rules around track records, as I said, and human rights violations or conditions on training and support, but ultimately a sovereign military cannot be stopped from how it will decide to exert its power, certainly not from the get-go and not without a negotiation process. You are always, whenever you are growing a hard capability, you are always running a risk with that exertion being taken to the extreme. So how can the lessons around civil military engagement, be it on human security, which I know we'll hear about later today, human rights or the protection of civilians, translate into the training of other militaries in a substantive and measured way? And this, again, goes back to the rules apply in this context as they do in the previous context that Anthony spoke about, which is building trust between these actors early and often in the steady state, and then trying to apply them in high intensity conflict. Extremely difficult to do, easier said than done, but there's no question that steady state of affairs provide for better policy than high emotionally preconditioned times. Training and education curriculum by any military must include international humanitarian law, human rights, and human security in a substantive and meaningful way. And finally, the civilian angle of military operations must be weaved across all efforts surrounding military to military engagement, be it in weapons sales, institutional reform, capacity and technical skill, and most practically, training. Civil-military engagement is a long game. It is cross-cutting, it is cross-operational, cross-regional, and cross-generational. Everyone will remember what happened in this instance for years to come. Pulling all the levers of civil-military engagement as a way to mitigate the challenges of the civilian environment should be the rule and not the exception. And lastly, I hope that what is happening in the region does not cause us to paint civil-military relationships with a broad brush. There is a lot to be learned here. The Middle East has always been a difficult region, but what has happened in Gaza carries the risk to poison the well for civil-military engagement in other contexts. And of course, I would count on all of you as the community, on all of us as the community who are working on this topic to continue to carry this cause and take away some of these considerations. Thank you.
Wow, many thanks for your today's contribution, Stanislava. Very nice and very much enlightening for what we might discuss in the second part of our today's session when it comes to the Q&As and the questions and comments being put by our audience. I learned a lot already. I have put up some keywords for myself already. I see a uniting factor between what you have been discussing and Anthony has been emphasizing as well, talking about trust. I think trust is one of the aspects we are going to look at when it comes to civ-mil relationship as well. You were discussing aspects such as having an understanding of the civil environment and of the conflict as such. You were talking about access to information, access to actors. And I think that's all kind of uniting factors when it comes to civil-military cooperation. So you have really been drawing the line between what your experience is and what the subject is we are confronted with and what we are dealing with. We are supposed to be the experts on. I think having said that, seeing already the first questions to arise in our chat, we will park those questions for the question and answer